He extended his hand. The cameras clicked, the air tense with anticipation. But then, in a moment that would spark headlines across continents, Ibrahim Traoré did the unthinkable. He did not salute, did not smile, did not even nod. He simply stood there, still and steady, staring directly into the eyes of former U.S. President Donald J. Trump. And in that silence, something shattered: protocol, expectations, and perhaps history itself. No one saw it coming. The summit was supposed to be routine. Another diplomatic photo op with carefully rehearsed gestures and polite applause. But Ibrahim Traoré, the young revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso, came with a message, and it wasn't written on paper. It was in his stance, in his refusal, in his unapologetic defiance of a man once considered the most powerful figure on earth. For a brief second, even Trump was caught off guard. He raised his chin, expecting the usual deference, a salute, a respectful nod, maybe even a hesitant smile. But instead, Traoré's eyes didn't flinch. His lips didn't part. His hand remained by his side. What followed wasn't chaos. It was worse. For the egos in the room, at least, it was silence. A thick, suffocating silence that said more than any speech. The air was thick with confusion, unease, and then realization. This wasn't a diplomatic blunder. This was intentional. It was personal. And it was about something much bigger than two men on a stage. Behind closed doors, reporters scrambled for context. Was it a miscommunication, a snub, or something deeper? And then Traoré spoke. Not to the press. Not through a spokesperson. He addressed the people, his people, and the world, through a recorded statement that would send aftershocks across political landscapes. He began not with condemnation, but with a story. When I was 15, he said, I saw my first documentary about what happened in Libya, how the richest country in Africa was reduced to rubble, not by its own people, but by decisions made far away, decisions made in rooms like the one I stood in today. That's when people realized this wasn't about Trump the man. It was about what he represented. Traoré's refusal to salute was not an insult to one individual, but a declaration, a cry against decades of exploitation, interference, and disregard for African sovereignty. I do not salute men who sign away lives like lines on a contract. Traoré continued, his voice calm but cutting. I do not bow to those who saw Africa as a playground for profit and a pawn in their global chess game. The response was immediate. On Western media, opinions split sharply. Some called him disrespectful, ungrateful, even dangerous. But on African soil, he was a storm of inspiration. Young people flooded social platforms, chanting his name. Elders nodded in quiet approval. Activists played the clip on loop during protests. Because for them, this moment wasn't just symbolic. It was revolutionary. You see, Traoré didn't just refuse a salute. He rejected an entire legacy, one built on coups dressed as diplomacy, on aid laced with strings, on partnerships that only ever seemed to benefit one side. And his refusal was a mirror held up not just to Trump, but to every leader, foreign and domestic, who had played a role in keeping Africa divided, dependent, and deceived. Was it risky? Absolutely. Traoré knew the cost. He had seen what happened to leaders who dared to stand tall. Sankara, Lumumba, Gaddafi. Men who dreamed too loudly, loved too fiercely, and died too early. But he also knew something else. Fear could no longer lead. So, in that one moment, frozen in photographs and replayed in slow motion, Traoré changed the rules. He shifted the tone. He showed that dignity could be louder than diplomacy, that silence could be sharper than sound. The world hadn't just witnessed a political incident. It had witnessed the rebirth of resistance. African resistance, not through war, but through posture, through principle. And as that chapter closed, one truth became clear. The refusal wasn't the story. The reason behind it was. But what was Trump's reaction behind the scenes? And why did some African leaders secretly criticize Traoré for it? In Chapter 2, we dive deeper into the fallout, both political and personal, and how a single act of defiance sent shockwaves through elite circles from Washington to Ouagadougou. Behind every camera flash, there's a shadow no one sees. And after that cold refusal, the unsaluted handshake, the unbent spine, those shadows began to twist into panic. Inside the marble halls of the summit venue, aides moved quickly. U.S. diplomats whispered furiously behind closed doors. A phone call was placed. Then another. Trump, now off stage, paced with narrowed eyes and clenched fists, the smirk he wore during the initial awkward pause now gone. What the hell was that? He reportedly barked to one of his aides. No one had a clear answer, because this wasn't part of the script. In the age of diplomacy as theater, every gesture is rehearsed, every handshake choreographed. But Traoré had just thrown out the script entirely, and that terrified people in power, not just because it was bold, but because it was effective. Trump's camp immediately began damage control. Anonymous statements were released suggesting miscommunication, blaming cultural misunderstandings. But the truth was, they knew exactly what happened. He had been challenged, not in words, but in front of the world, and worse, by someone younger, bolder, and unafraid. But as the American press lit up, something else was unfolding on the African continent. Something even more telling. In private meetings, several African heads of state expressed concern about Traoré's actions. Some, in tightly controlled briefings, condemned the act as diplomatically immature. One West African president allegedly told a French diplomat, "He is playing with fire. You do not antagonize America." But why the criticism from his own continent? Because Traoré had exposed something uncomfortable: complicity. He didn't just challenge the West's dominance. He questioned the submission of Africa's own leadership class, the ones who nodded in every meeting, signed every one-sided deal, and posed smiling with men who offered loans in one hand and shackles in the other. And for them, Traoré wasn't just rebellious. He was dangerous. His popularity among the youth surged after the incident. Street murals of the moment, Traoré standing firm, Trump mid-handshake, began appearing in Ouagadougou, Dakar, and even Nairobi. Social media turned it into a symbol. The caption? "We salute no one but our people." But while the youth celebrated, elite circles felt the tremor. Washington sent back-channel messages through ECOWAS. The World Bank suddenly reviewed a development package meant for Burkina Faso. A former U.S. ambassador went on record saying, he needs to understand that actions have consequences. Traoré did understand. He just wasn't afraid of them. In fact, in a bold follow-up interview, he said, "If standing with dignity threatens our aid, then it was never aid, it was leverage." And the blowback? It wasn't just political, it was deeply personal. Back home, members of Traoré's own transitional government began to grow nervous. Some whispered that the country couldn't afford isolation, that his defiance might lead to sanctions, that Burkina Faso was too small to provoke giants. Traoré responded the only way he knew how, not with retreat, but with revelation. He opened the books. For the first time, his administration publicly released a breakdown of every international loan, every military agreement, every extractive contract signed in the last 2 decades. The numbers were damning. Billions of dollars in gold and oil had flowed out. Mere crumbs had returned. "This is what salutes bought us," he declared in a national address. Poverty, dependency, silence. His words weren't loud, but they echoed. That week, student unions across West Africa held forums titled The Traoré Doctrine. Civil rights leaders in South Africa invoked his name in speeches about neocolonialism. Even Pan-African intellectuals, long disillusioned by the political class, found themselves intrigued. But not everyone was applauding. Behind the curtain, intelligence networks buzzed. Western analysts began digging deeper into Traoré's past. Rumors of foreign influence were floated, an old trick used whenever a black leader acts too independently. The goal? To question his legitimacy, to make him look like a puppet of some hidden power, rather than a man acting on principle. But none of it stuck, because Ibrahim Traoré was no one's puppet. He was too raw, too rooted, too relatable, and more than anything, too clear in his mission. The rejection of Trump wasn't a one-off moment. It was a spark of something larger. But then came the turning point. A leaked document, allegedly from within the U.S. State Department. revealed a proposed series of economic recalibrations for countries showing signs of anti-Western nationalism. Burkina Faso was on the list. The message was clear: rebel and pay the price. Yet instead of backing down, Traoré called a public town hall with students, farmers, and soldiers. And standing without bodyguards under the sun, he said, "If freedom costs us comfort, so be it. If it costs us favor, so be it. But if we never risk, we never rise." The crowd erupted, and the movement deepened. Because now, the question wasn't just about Trump or about one summit. It was about a shift in Africa's political soul. While African youth were painting murals of Traoré and chanting his words in packed stadiums, far from the drum beats and dust of Ouagadougou, another kind of meeting was taking place. One behind frosted glass, somewhere in Washington, D.C. The mood was tense. A classified report had been passed around the room, marked urgent, destabilizing influence in the Sahel. The subject? Ibrahim Traoré. An aide placed a map on the table. Burkina Faso was marked in red. But what worried the officials wasn't just one country. It was a red glow beginning to spread around it. Mali, Niger, Guinea, all nations where leaders had begun to echo Traoré's rhetoric. Words like sovereignty, dignity, Pan-Africanism, words that once lived in history books were now filling campaign speeches and public squares. The memo was blunt. If this isn't checked now, we lose a region for a generation. Inside that secure room, one plan emerged with quiet urgency: not confront Traoré directly, but to surround him, discredit him, isolate him, and if necessary, replace him. But how do you dismantle a leader whose weapon is moral clarity? You attack the narrative. Within weeks, an orchestrated media campaign began to unfold. International headlines questioned Traoré's democratic credentials, citing concerns about press freedom and the transitional nature of his government. Suddenly, Western think tanks began publishing op-eds about the growing threat of militarized populism in West Africa. But here's the thing: they weren't wrong to question power. Power should always be questioned. Traoré himself believed that. But the timing, the coordinated messaging, the sudden burst of scrutiny after he challenged the West status quo, it was no coincidence. Still, Traoré didn't flinch. In fact, he addressed the accusations head-on. "You call me undemocratic," he said in a press conference. "But where were your voices when our elected leaders sold our resources in silence? Where was your outrage when children mined gold for Western tech and the profits never touched our schools?" And once again, he reframed the conversation. This wasn't about whether Traoré had flaws. He did. All leaders do. This was about whether the scrutiny was genuine or strategic, and the people could see through it. But behind the scenes, darker moves were underway. A leaked intelligence cable revealed that certain foreign-backed NGOs were suddenly pouring funds into media houses and political organizations within Burkina Faso. Some of them advocated democratic transition. Others spoke vaguely of civil society empowerment. But several, when traced, had direct links to lobbying firms with past ties to regime change operations. And then came the whispers that a coalition of opposition figures, quietly funded and coached abroad, was preparing to challenge Traoré, not in elections but on the streets. The goal wasn't governance. It was destabilization. And yet, Traoré remained unshaken. Instead of fighting shadows, he brought light. In a national address, he held up the intelligence report, live, on camera. He didn't accuse anyone by name. He didn't need to. "All I ask is this," he said. "Let the people decide who speaks for them. Not foreign bank accounts. Not imported NGOs. Not influencers in expensive suits who have never drunk our water, walked our fields, or buried our dead." That night, his approval ratings in Burkina Faso soared. But even more remarkably, his influence was now crossing borders. In Senegal, students marched with signs that read, "Traoré is not just a name, it's a mirror." In the Congo, artists began painting his face next to Patrice Lumumba and Thomas Sankara, as if he were the next chapter in a long-forgotten book of freedom fighters. And in South Africa, a young activist said during a live debate, "We've been asking for a leader who speaks like us, walks like us, fights for us. I didn't know his name last year, but now I know what courage sounds like. But it wasn't just Africans who were watching. In a rare off-the-record conversation, a high-level European diplomat reportedly said, "This man, he's a bigger threat than any insurgent group because he's clean. He believes what he says. And worse, people believe him. Because that's what makes a movement dangerous, not its weapons, but its ideas." Traoré had become a lightning rod, a symbol of possibility. And symbols are hard to kill. Still, the pressure mounted. The IMF quietly delayed a routine financial review. A major telecom company mysteriously announced it was reevaluating operations in Burkina Faso. Travel advisories were updated, discouraging business. It was economic warfare by another name, a warning shot to remind him of the cost of defiance. But Traoré was ready. Weeks earlier, he had launched a bold initiative, the African Sovereignty Fund, a partnership between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger to create an emergency reserve for fuel, food, and essential supplies independent of foreign donors. The message was clear: we will not starve into silence. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy, but it was unprecedented. And as the economic noose tightened, something unexpected happened. Ordinary citizens, tailors, farmers, teachers, began donating to the fund. Not millions, just what they could. A few francs here, a basket of rice there. One grandmother even offered her jewelry, saying, "For my grandchildren, not for gold." And that's when the West realized something terrifying. They weren't just dealing with a politician anymore. They were dealing with the people on fire. The sun was setting over Lake Geneva, casting a gold reflection across the quiet water. Inside the vast, high-ceilinged UN Assembly Hall, global leaders sat in polished silence. Some expected a speech. Few expected a reckoning. Ibrahim Traoré adjusted the microphone. Then he looked up, not at the delegates, but at the cameras. The world was watching. He didn't begin with greetings, or diplomacy, or the usual carefully worded acknowledgments. He began with this: "You asked why I refuse to salute. Today, I'll tell you." And in that moment, 193 nations held their breath. He didn't name Trump. He didn't need to. This wasn't about a single man. It was about a pattern, a system, a history of applause for oppression dressed as partnership. And as he spoke, his voice didn't rise, but it burned. He told them about Burkina Faso, about a nation rich in gold, but poor in water, about contracts written in Paris, but signed in Ouagadougou, about aid that bought silence, not strength. Then came the moment that would go viral around the world. Traoré paused, held up a black and white photo of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader who once dared to dream of a sovereign Africa and was assassinated for it. The image wasn't high resolution. It was old, grainy, and creased at the edges. But it didn't need clarity. It had weight. "Your countries didn't salute Sankara either," Traoré said softly. "You armed those who ended him. And then you sent flowers." The room was still. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others looked down. A few, mostly from the global south, nodded slowly. And then he pivoted. This wasn't just a speech of grievance. It was a manifesto of rebirth. He spoke of a new alignment, not east, not west, but inward. African nations pooling resources, building their own institutions, a continental satellite program already under design, a regional currency in its early stages, an education exchange system where children in Mali could study in Ghana without needing a visa. No more borrowed futures, he said. No more handshakes that come with handcuffs. Outside the UN building, something remarkable was happening. Hundreds of African students, activists, and workers had gathered, not with protest signs, but with drums, flags, and flowers. They sang old liberation songs, mixing them with new ones that carried Traoré's words like wildfire. And on social media, a new hashtag exploded, hashtag the refusal. It wasn't just about not saluting. It was about everything that followed. A refusal to surrender identity. A refusal to accept crumbs. A refusal to believe that dignity must be earned through obedience. But with the spotlight came the storm. The U.S. delegation, red-faced and rattled, issued a cold statement accusing Traoré of divisive rhetoric. Several European envoys walked out midway through his address. One Western anchor scoffed live on air. He's just another populist riding a moment. But the youth weren't watching that anchor. They were watching Traoré, because something deeper had clicked across the continent. Universities replayed the speech in auditoriums. High school students quoted it in essays. In marketplaces, old men played the clip on cracked phones, nodding silently. And then came the dominoes. In Chad, a group of young military officers refused to participate in a joint training program funded by a foreign power, citing national dignity. In Zimbabwe, a movement to review old colonial mining contracts gained traction. In Nigeria, university students launched a campaign called Books Before Bullets, directly inspired by Traoré's line, "You cannot educate us with fear." But the boldest moment came days later, when leaders from 5 West African nations met privately in Bamako and, for the first time, discussed a regional charter based on the Traoré principles. No resource agreements without local ownership. No foreign military bases without public consent. No loans without transparency. No diplomacy without dignity. It wasn't signed. Not yet, but it was discussed. And that alone was historic. Back in Burkina Faso, a quiet scene unfolded. One that didn't make the headlines, but carried the soul of the entire story. A young boy, no older than 10, stood outside a school in Bobo Dioulasso. He held a drawing, crude, with pencil lines and uneven shading. It showed 2 men. One stood with his hand extended. The other stood firm, his fist by his side. Above them, in shaky handwriting, the boy had written, "We salute when we are free." That's what it had come to mean. Traoré's refusal wasn't just a protest. It was a blueprint, not for war, but for awakening. Because every empire falls, not from foreign invasion, but from a rise of self-belief among the people they once ruled. And Ibrahim Traoré, the young soldier who dared to stand still in a room full of pressure, had reminded a continent that it was never powerless, just misled, misused, and ready to rise. The final image, not of a handshake refused, but of millions of hands lifted, not in salute, but in solidarity. This was more than a moment. It was a movement.